Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Val Stanley. I am one of your, excuse me, co-chairs of the Physical Sample Curation Cluster, along with Joan Damerow and Andrea Thomer, who are both here, as well as our wonderful fellow Natalie. So please say hi to them. And yeah, so we're here today, this morning, to talk to you about next steps for our cluster's projects to work towards the goal of understanding and figuring out the puzzle of sample citation. Next slide. And that's what we look like. So if you need to find us out in the wild, that's us. And then also want to invite you to our upcoming meetings. So we're gonna debrief on Tuesday, February 13th from all of this. And as you'll learn, if you haven't already, we've been working on a paper kind of in tandem with author guidelines related to sample citation. And there's a writing sprint on February 8th. And of course, there's a link for joining our cluster. Our background is that we put together this cluster a number of years ago, just kind of to get things going for physical samples in the data and informatics world. And we've kind of started to tackle sample citation and issues related to getting things out into publications, because persistent identifiers are wonderful, but if there's no game plan for implementing them, that's kind of the next piece to figure out. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I guess I just sort of went over our agenda in the opposite order. But anyway, so yeah, we're gonna talk to you real quick about what we've been up to and projects we've been working on, as well as kind of where the current landscape is for publishing things about your samples and tracking those things, reviewing a couple of use cases for various challenges that we've identified. But really what we want to do with you here today is we've set aside a whole chunk of time to do an activity together where we're all going to put on our thinking caps and come up with our pie in the sky wish list of what a sample citation tool would look like. And then hopefully we will have enough time with this group of 20 folks to get together and actually talk about what we do on those Jamboards. But Andrea will talk to you more about that project or that piece of this session. And then real quick, we wanted to talk to you about the things that we've been working on. So here is a nice little shot of the 4 steps to publish and cite open earth science samples. This was out on the table at the data help desk at AGU. Natalie did a wonderful job making this very visually appealing. But basically just distilling this project we've been working on to identify what authors need to think about when talking about samples in their papers, and distilling it into this lovely little flyer with just like the main ideas that people need to keep in mind. Yeah, and then the larger piece to that is our checklist guide. We called this our author guidelines for a long time, but we've kind of reorganized it into a checklist since that would be probably more helpful for folks. So there's a link here and probably over here in our notes that Natalie has dropped into the chat. Thank you for that piece. If you would like to take a look at it, we would love you to have a look at it. And then our next thing that we've been doing in our writing sprints is writing a paper related to all this, because while there's where we're at presently and what we can do with current infrastructure by reviewing all that and thinking about it over the years, it's clear that there are some other pieces that we need in order to make that happen. And so we're trying to write that up and submit it this spring to kind of get that out there. I think that's all I have on that for you. Any questions? Okay.
Yeah, next I just wanted to remind everyone what some of our goals were for developing the sample sharing guide, and then I'll show you what it looks like right now and just give a brief overview of what we have after we presented a lot of some of the specifics that we'd come up with in our last the summer meeting, and distributed a form that many of you may have responded to get feedback on what some of our specific recommendations were, and we accounted for all of that in our current guide that we just published in the ESIP Figshare last week. So yeah, I just wanted to review our goals. What we wanted to do with this was come up with guidelines that would help authors make their samples and associated data more open and fair. Just provide the basic information about how to describe and reference samples in their journal publications using currently available infrastructure. Make it possible for sample repositories and collectors to get credit when samples are used. Make it possible to find and access samples that are used in a study. And then really thinking about what we would need for the foundational elements that would enable more sophisticated, complex citations in the future, and tools in the future that would help us track use of samples across publications. So because of that, we have some recommendations for sample identifiers and cross-domain metadata that would be needed to make that happen. And so this author guide is distilled into 4 main steps. And those are describing samples with rich metadata, assigning identifiers, publishing and citing data sets, and then referencing sample identifiers in the paper. And this DOI will now take you to the ESIP Figshare document here, which is a PDF. So I just wanted to give you a look at what the format looks like and how we've structured it, because we went through a couple of iterations trying to make it as readable as possible. And so if you have any feedback on the overall format or the content, we will be publishing another version of this in the next few weeks or so. So there's definitely still opportunities. We envision publishing new versions over time as needed. And so in the beginning of this guide, we have the a table of contents with the basic steps. And for each of the steps, we really try to distill it to the main key thing, the key action item that we want people to do. So
Joan, would you mind zooming in just a little? It's a little small.
Oh, yeah.
Great.
So for step 1, basically just describing the key characteristics and collection details of samples used for the paper, often by providing a sample metadata file or table. And we have some specific recommendations there and some links to example templates. And then we have a further reading section where we do have more details on why you should do this and giving some additional examples there. So we did this format to kind of pull out the key points, but then also provide all of the some of the additional information that people might need to actually do some of these things if they're getting into the details. And then step 2, assigning or using identifiers for samples. We broke it up into a few different options so that there are some different considerations for different scenarios. So we have what to think about if publishing samples from long-term physical collections, which one of the key things is consulting with the sample manager in these cases to obtain identifiers, because they would often be the ones who would have access or be providing the identifiers. And samples used in multiple analyses or publications, and how you can get identifiers from either your institution or through a system like CSAR, the System for Earth and Extraterrestrial Sample Registration, where folks from across a variety of different organizations can use their infrastructure to obtain persistent identifiers as well as manage their samples. So that is really one of the key organizations that of course, provides a user-friendly service for a variety of scientists. And so we really wanted to call that out while also pointing out that some individual institutions may also provide services to get identifiers for their samples. And then we have some recommendations when subsamples are sent to laboratories for analyses. One of the key things here is making sure that you provide the laboratory a source material identifier. And then also often when a data set or paper includes results from laboratory analyses, one of the key things that you would cite is the identifiers that may be provided by the laboratory. Yeah, and then there are definitely a lot of nuances with assigning identifiers, and we try to address them as clearly as possible. And then we provide some further reading with some additional examples and considerations and details for when people are need that information. And then the next step is publishing and citing samples and data sets. And so we give some recommendations there on what to include in the data set, and citing the data set in the reference section of the paper, and including it in the data availability statement. And then finally providing some guidelines or recommendations on how to reference sample identifiers in the paper itself. And so you can, again, we welcome additional feedback here, and we will, like I mentioned, we will be publishing further, additional versions of this. And so we can definitely include edits or additions or even changes in formatting. That any feedback that you have, we welcome that. And then so here we have a link to the active draft where you can get in there and help us with editing or adding comments. And we would definitely use that in our next version. So with that, we can take a little bit of time for questions or about the guidelines or anything that we're working on.
Well, Joan, we should also add that our next goal is to go through the ESIP ratification process, I think it's called, to make this an official ESIP standard or recommendation. And so there will be, I think there's other opportunities through feedback on that too. Megan can probably say more to that.
Yeah, there's usually a 30-day comment period, particularly amongst the ESIP partner organizations, but anyone's welcome to give input. So that will be a part of the process. I can put in a link for that.
Sky?
Hey, yeah, thanks. Good morning. I'm glad I came to this session today, and I'm sorry I haven't been keeping up with the work that you guys have been doing. I've been working on something very similar to this as we've been trying to get the IGSN registry process really in full swing for USGS. And so I have a very similar document to this with a lot of the same content that I've been working up as a protocols.io protocol with a paper to +1 for that content. And so I'd really rather not do that since you guys are sort of at the same place and collaborate together toward this. But I guess had you thought about maybe going that route with it, sort of with an overarching paper to describe the process, a lot of the sort of further information and whatnot that you have there is the kind of stuff that will stand the test of time and would be part of that, while the protocol itself could be versioned pretty readily through that protocols.io platform in terms of changing individual steps or pointing things off to another area, that sort of thing, via that versioning mechanism, as opposed to the Figshare route. I mean, either one I think will be fine. And, you know, I'll work with you also. I don't duplicate effort and contribute a bit, you know, to what you have. But, you know, it might be worth considering as you look toward the next steps, kind of taking that protocols route. We're really trying to implement that by and large across our labs, where right now we have many internal, you know, SOPs that we really need to get out into published protocols so that we can cite them appropriately from data that is produced according to those protocols in some way. So just a thought to think about, and I'll be in touch about contributions there. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. We can definitely look into that. We were using that ESIP Figshare just to be we aren't married to that, but that's where we also publish the flyer. But yeah, if protocols.io has some better versioning capabilities, we could definitely consider that. And yeah, I think that if you do have a similar document, we could kind of review what you have as well and see how we could include some of that in here if that's what you're interested in. And we are working on this associated paper, so that's where we could really expand on some of the points as well.
Yeah, I want to double support for joining us on the paper because it's a fairly limited group of, it's mostly, it's like 5 of us that are mostly working on it right now. So we would absolutely welcome more authors, I think. Yeah, and joining forces with USGS would be a really great way to make sure that like we have the bulk of earth sciences or a big player in earth sciences behind these. I think that'd be great for adoption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we are we have a section on use cases that we'll talk a little bit about some of the high level information for some of them, but for example, we are going through use cases that we have across the Department of Energy's Biological and Environmental Research Program, and so there are quite a lot of people who have been involved in these use cases who will also be included on the paper. And any other questions or comments? All right, we can move on, then I'll share my screen. So this is kind of a high level outline for some of the things that we're addressing in the paper, specifically some specific use cases, going through some of the recommended practices, and also community and infrastructure needs that we'll talk more about today. And then I'm going to hand it over to Andrea. Oh, wait, no, we have some use cases. Yes, Andrea is the first use case.
Yeah, so the next thing that we're doing more broadly is working on this paper. And part of the paper is to explain and contextualize the guidelines, but another part of it is to point out the gaps that need to be filled in actually making sample citation more of a reality. One of the hardest things we found when working on creating these guidelines was that there's stuff that we want to happen, like individuals getting credit for their sample collection or collections getting credit for it, but the infrastructure just isn't there, or the infrastructure is there, but the organizations that control it aren't doing things in a way that means sample citations can propagate. So that's what these use cases are. They're motivating, they're ways for us to illustrate what are the gaps. So this first use case is one that I've been working on for a while. And it's about how we need to document sample provenance and credit for physical sample collectors and repositories. So that means both individuals who are collecting samples, like individual geoscientists, and large physical sample repositories like core repositories or museums. The reason they need to do this is because they are often forced to show evidence of their impact over time. So museums are often asked to justify keeping their collections, And a great way to theoretically do that is to be able to quickly show all the research that's come out of their samples. And for individuals to, many people want to show where the individual samples have been used in other people's work as well. And for collections managers, it's also important for making strategic decisions about collections management potentially. So are there things that are less used that maybe don't need to be curated as urgently as other materials? The challenges here for this use case is that there's really inconsistent use of sample identifiers in the literature. So of course, anything prior to like the last 20 years and probably more like 5 is not using a persistent identifier to cite samples. It's usually some ad hoc sort of field number or a museum catalog number, which is usually inconsistently formatted, rarely actually in the text of the paper, and often missing altogether. On top of that, samples are often listed in the supplementary materials of papers, which are hard to access and often just kind of mysteriously disappear from the scholarly record as the large publishers move from one platform to another. Those sorts of things just get lost. So the current practices here is that people do try to do text mining to pull identifiers out of the papers that do exist, but it's a super incomplete view of sample use. I've also seen collectors create things like Google Scholar pages that aggregate papers that use their collections, but this is also very time consuming. You have to do it manually, and it's also a really rough metric of use and impact. I think next slide. And what this is, so this is just illustrating some of what I was talking about with how the references that exist are often very vague and in random or not random, but inconsistently placed within papers, which makes even text mining hard. So often people will say things like, we used adult skulls of bat specimens from the UMMZ, but they don't actually specify which ones. Or the identifier, in this case, a catalog number, will be embedded in a caption, which is tricky to actually get out in a systematic sort of way. I think that's it for this one. Although I see a question in the chat. I'll address this later. I don't want to, I'll answer the chat if you guys want to move on with the other use cases.
I think you could go ahead.
Okay.
There's a question.
Yes, so this project was with some collaborators at Michigan, and we did use XDD and did not find as much as we were really hoping to with it. I think part of it was because it's, I know that XDD is supposed to be more disciplinarily agnostic, but I think it's still heavily geosciences, and these were, a lot of what we were looking for was in biology papers or zoology. So I wonder if there were things in there. But we tried XDD. I think we were also using, I can't remember off the top of my head, OpenAlex, a couple of different ways of querying the full text of things. And I think really the biggest thing is that just the identifiers aren't there. It hasn't been the practice to include them regularly. Sometimes there'll be like an acknowledgement at the end saying thanks to X museum for use of their specimens. But the details are usually like in supplementary materials if they're there at all. And the supplementary materials are not in any of those databases.
Yeah, as a person who works in collections and has seen what Andrea said about like having Google Scholar things and just trying your best. Oftentimes people like to abbreviate identifiers in their papers for simplicity's sake. And then that removes the possibility of finding it.
Yeah. We've been working on a paper for too long, writing up this little project that we did. I need to turn back to it and actually get it out there. It's one of those ones that's stuck at 75% written, and I need to get the last 25% done.
Okay. Are there any other questions in the chat or anything that we should do before we move on?
I think we're good.
Okay. So yeah, the second use case is that I've talked a little about in some previous meetings is connecting interdisciplinary sample data and other research outputs. So this is when you have samples that were sent out to numerous collaborators in different labs for a variety of different like biological and environmental analyses. And then they need to be compiled and analyzed and published. But they do this in different files and data systems that are currently really disconnected. So the issue is that with current practices, and this kind of use case in particular, even more so than with the long-term collections, sample records are really rarely, if ever, published with standard metadata and identifiers. We're trying to change that in our community because we do have a lot of these projects where this would be, this is really critical to be able to link and exchange information. But we still have a long way to go. So they're still rarely published with the persistent identifiers. And then another issue is that there are some institutions that provide persistent identifiers, but the main one has been CSAR, which has been great. They provide really great sample management tools and persistent identifiers, but there may be a need for more institutions to provide these services that would be kind of geared towards the needs of specific communities. And in general, the process of submitting samples to different labs and data systems and then compiling the resulting data has been really inefficient and even prone to error. So that's been one of the key challenges that could be addressed by using some of the recommendations that we've outlined. And like I said, the sample data and associated information are often disconnected, so you can't use these samples in the future to their full potential. And we don't currently have infrastructure that effectively tracks provenance and metrics. And then this is just an illustration of what we ideally need to do with some of these samples. We often have more complex workflows where we want to track all of the subsamples that are sent out for different analyses, and document all of the preparations and processes that take place in generating or preserving the subsample and running the analyses and processing the raw data. And all of this information may be needed in the metadata records for the sample chain that starts from the source material and then goes through a number of different subsampling and resulting data. And you need all of this information to understand the final results. And so we can use the identifiers and connection metadata to construct resource maps and link all of the relevant data to a given source parent record and all the child records. And some systems are doing this effectively, like CSAR and EarthChem, but many others are not at present. And so we're working on changing that. And a major need that, of course, we've been discussing in this cluster is tracking credit and provenance, but how do we do that? We are planning to work with the RDA Complex Citations Working Group on use cases for samples. And we're planning to schedule a hackathon that we'll also mention at the very end of some of our next steps. But we have been thinking about this as we work on our use cases, and just wanted to show like some of our goals here and what we want to be able to do. We can, like I mentioned, we can use standard metadata like identifiers and resource type and relationship type to track the use of citations and samples. And this is going to be needed for both credit when samples are integrated into analyses, and for tracking links to relevant resources and recording that provenance information automatically. So to illustrate how you can do this, you might have a set of source material samples that are used in a data set. The data set contains a sample metadata file describing the samples included in the data set. And if the samples have IGSNs or other persistent identifiers, then the source material sample could be updated as being cited by the data set with a link, an automated link going back to that data set, so you can really understand how these samples are used. And note that this can get more complicated and that we might have multiple levels of subsamples, as I mentioned in the previous slide. But this is just showing one like more of a simplified view. Another option is that we can create a sample collection, which may include hundreds of samples. So each individual sample is considered part of that collection. And then the collection could be cited in the references of a data set. And then the data set can be cited by a journal publication. And so again, we can use the identifiers and connection metadata to automatically track use of the sample in both the data sets and the journal publications, and then propagate these links back to the source material sample records. So again, we don't have tools that do this, but I think this is something that we can work towards, and something that the complex citation working group is trying to tackle, and all of the relationships and coordination that we might need to do with both data repositories and indexers and journal publishers to make this happen. And then related to this, there is an issue with where some labs need to track credit for conducting their analyses. So this is another consideration that's come up. So when a lab publishes data, provides biological samples, they often lose control of the provenance information when it gets into the hands of a third party. Approaches that preserve the provenance and accumulate metadata in a consistent manner are really needed in these cases. So again, we need, well, currently there in the literature, there are, again, in this use case, many authors are not publishing standard identifiers, or so some of them are non-standard, or there's not including identifiers to samples at all. There is in the genomics community the opportunity to use biosamples, and many papers are in fact citing biosamples and bio projects. So this is one potentially good solution for the genomics community, but there's still inconsistent use of these, and just generally due to variations and interpretations of the standards that have been put out by the Genetic Standards Consortium. And so again, we still have these non-standard references. And this is somewhat related, but Val had a couple of additional points here on citing large numbers of samples.
Yeah, I feel like this is a very important use case and very practical. Like, we know that this is a thing that people need to talk about their samples in publications. There are plenty of people that, you know, have thousands of samples related to a study that they've done. And then in order to incorporate those into their paper is important, but that takes up an awful lot of space, and sometimes word counts are a problem. So yeah, like Joan was saying, I feel like this is very much related to a lot of the other use cases, but it's also important to have it out as kind of its own separate one, because it's so important. The tricky bit is finding an actual use case for it, because it's so hard. So if anybody knows of a really great example of this, we would love to see it. So yeah, so in terms of what we've got as an example presently, it seems like the challenge is mostly the infrastructure needed to do this in order to link things together. And the complex citation concept is probably a really promising way to figure this out and make it work, or at least it feels pretty darn good. And the example that we have really right now is just linking data sets and publications. And that right now, that's very hard, just because there's lots of things that have to happen manually at present.
Yeah, so just we wanted to give a summary of some of the challenges and needs that we've identified, and this will feed into the activity as well. So you've heard about some of these in the use cases that we brought up, but we currently have inconsistent community practices. So some of the things that we can work on is really promoting widespread use of sample persistent identifiers, which of course organizations have done previously, but we just need this to really be expanded. And promoting the adoption of some baseline cross-disciplinary metadata standards, particularly some standards on linking external resources and widespread use of these. We currently have inconsistent author and affiliation information, which is really important for credit. So like use of identifiers for authors and institutions would really help with this as well. And I think we're making a lot of progress with this in government agencies, and that will hopefully improve. And then, like we've been working on with one of our goals for the guidance is providing clearer instructions for authors, editors, and publishers, and really getting it out there, like working with, I guess, promoting our guidelines with a variety of different groups, I think will be important for that. And then in addition to this, we need infrastructure improvements. Currently, many data systems aren't using persistent identifiers to their full potential. We need more widespread use and consistent methods of searching and retrieving metadata associated with samples. So API standards and metadata formats for that. Automated cross-linking would be really useful. Using some of that metadata to automatically add like cross links from samples to data sets and papers, for example, and then just generally provenance tracking over time. And I know all of this is really hard, and people have been working on this for a while now, but I think we've also reached a point where we can start making more progress.
Okay, so this takes us to our activity for this. We are not going to force you into breakout rooms, which hopefully will mean that people don't drop off the call now that we've said that we want you to help us do stuff. Like we said before, our goal in this paper is to point out some of the gaps, but we also want to try to suggest ways of filling those gaps. And that's what we want your help doing in this activity. So we have a series of 3 prompts that are written in this Jamboard, and I'll put a link in the chat for it. Wait, I lost the chat. And the first one is, I'm assuming that you all care enough about samples to have these kinds of dreams, but what is your dream pie in the sky system for some aspect of sample discovery, citation, tracking, inclusion in your data set metadata, something like that? What we are hoping you will do is that you will, we have this, should I share my screen, or do you want to go to the Jamboard, Joan? Let me share mine. All right. We have this Jamboard. On this first screen of the Jamboard, we are hoping that you'll put sticky notes with ideas here. So Sky had a great one in the chat about how systems like XDD should, to play on Sky's, like, what if we had an index that was automatically generated from XDD rather than having to do it manually for every single museum that was trying to track the use of their samples. I think that that's a great example of something like that. Another, I don't know, idea could be like a system that automatically finds all the PIDs and their metadata and puts it as an additional file in your data set or something like that. So I want to take 10 minutes to kind of brainstorm ideas, and please put them in sticky notes here. If you haven't used Jamboards before, sticky notes are this button here, and you can change your color depending on your preference. There's also ways to draw if you'd like. If you have a full-on idea that you really want to sketch out, just click a few frames forward and you can get your own slide on which to illustrate things or type a lot. So any questions about this before we get started? I'm not seeing any hands, I don't think. Okay, so I'm gonna set my timer for like 10 minutes. If I see that sticky notes are no longer populating before then I'll call us back. But yeah, let's brainstorm some ways to make sample discovery and so on more, what's our dream system, assuming we have infinite money and infinite time in order to do this sort of thing.
Is there a way to add comments to these sticky notes?
No, I think you have to just add another sticky note and put it next to the relevant sticky note.
Okay.
I'm going to stop sharing so that I can make sticky notes as well and not have you all see my typing. A ton of great ideas. So I wanted to take a little bit of time to discuss some of this. I can kick us off. Like, I'm seeing a lot about field-based systems and some +2s around that. Let me share my screen again. Yeah, so sample birth certificates, and I think there was a comment, I think from Nick, that Strabo Spot is working on this. And I know that's something that a lot of folks have been working on in different contexts. But yeah, in a perfect world, we should be able to mint an IGSN when you're actually collecting your sample for the first time so that you don't have to mess around with it a lot later. Does anybody else, before I just start trying to read things, does anybody want to share some of the stuff that they wrote down, maybe got excited about?
I mean, these are all really great suggestions, and I think a lot of people have been thinking about that. I just wanted to emphasize one comment that I made, and you already said birth certificate. There are, requests for integrating the sample registration process into data submission. Ideally, the registration of a sample should happen way earlier before you generate the data. So, we can support that process, but I don't want to encourage people to wait until they submit their data for registering their sample. The important thing is that the persistent identifier stays with the sample throughout its lifetime, and specifically on its path through laboratories, so that, every different data set will have that IGSN attached to it. That it's just one insight.
Maybe if we start thinking of it as a thumbprint rather than a birth certificate, it's something that you never lose, but is theoretically unique. I think that they're all unique. Anybody else want to share anything?
The passport, which has
Passport, yeah.
Yeah, I think creating it early allows you to have parent-child relationships established. Otherwise, it just gets lost in the work.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out with that, I think that's really important. But for some of our use cases, we've had trouble getting people to do that early. Like that we had a hard time getting people to use the labels. Like they want to generate their own labels in the field. Like they don't want to do like some kind of new process, and they find it a lot easier to just like scribble their little sample labels in the field. But we have these processes where you're required to submit standard metadata when you send things to different labs. And so we were one of the most successful ways we give identifiers is like when like upon submission of their sample metadata to a specific lab, like those persistent identifiers would be automatically generated at that point. Because in our case, they're not like from long-term collections. I just wanted to point that out. It's a little bit hard when they're not from long-term collections because
And it's a good way to expose people to IGSNs if you're creating them for them, even if they didn't do it early. And it's still good to have them, I think.
yeah, it's just a challenge.
It's more work, so it's got to be valuable. Otherwise,
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah. I'm also seeing some ideas a lot about automating things so that we need ways of automating a lot of this metadata generation and tracking because yeah, like you said, if it's hard work, it's people have to make decisions about what they do in a limited work week. And this is something that often falls by the wayside. I like this one of provide tools that help you find similar samples across the sampleverse. I like that a lot. Is there a rock that you haven't considered for this study? Yeah, incentives for gamifying things. And this one is something, I don't know, this one I didn't want to highlight too much because it was mine, but it looks like there's a lot of related things of like collections dashboards or places where you can enter an IGSN and then come up with the network of related materials, papers, and things like that. I know Cesar is definitely working on things like that. But yeah, I like this as a goal.
It's more at the AIDA level. It's an effort that we call the sample nexus, where you basically build graphs of the connections between samples, data, and publications based on persistent identifiers. And we will do that initially for EarthChem and CISA and the Library of Experimental Phase Relations, but we want to build it as an index with a schema that others can use and basically contribute to, so that the discovery goes beyond just an internal system.
Yeah, that's great. All right, let's move on to our next prompt here. So the next slide of the, oh, and see some folks have started doing this already. Our next slide is how do the groups identified in this quadrant here need to change in order to realize your dream of perfect sample infrastructure? And so some of them are publishers. We've got data repositories, indexers and identifier services like Crossref and DataCite, and individual scientists. So yeah, how do these things need to change? I am a social scientist, so I want to like encourage you to think about social or cultural forces as well as technical, which often it's the social that's the bigger hurdle for things. So for like individual scientists, magically changing everybody into somebody who really cares about sample citation would be a goal, yet not an achievable one. So yeah, I'll set my timer again for about 10 minutes or so, and then we'll come back and discuss. On to the last one.
Yeah, the board is full.
Yeah, and the board is full. Anybody want to share anything in particular out of this? I'm seeing a lot around things we can do for individual scientists, which is pretty cool. A lot of good ideas in here around like training and workshops, incorporating data management into grad school curriculums. I know that's been a topic in ESIP in a variety of spaces for a long time. I like this one around translating terms as needed. So making sure that like we can come up, our guidelines right now are intended to be kind of discipline agnostic as much as you can be anyway. But I think there's a good argument for splitting off domain specific ones as long as they can crosswalk back together once people follow those guidelines. Something I will rant about entirely too much is how publishers, like especially the for-profit publishers and the indexers, actually need to support data citation, and therefore that would help us support sample citation better. I keep pointing to this paper that Shelley Stahl and a lot of collaborators worked on. Oops. That basically is pointing out the ways in which data citation is currently broken. And I think that's a really big issue that we need to, I don't know. I would love to figure out a way to put pressure on those commercial entities to actually fix this for us, their customers. Okay, so if there's nobody else that wants to share, I'm going to move to the last one. What do you think the biggest roadblock to achieving an ideal sample infrastructure is, and what action would you like to see next, either from our cluster, from ESIP in general, or the earth sciences more generally? So I'll set my timer again, and then we'll come back to wrap up. So I went through and added very rough stars to the ones that are related to things, next steps for the cluster. So thank you all for those ideas, because that makes our lives easier as we start planning for the next year. So some of them are, what if EarthChem gives a short presentation on how it's done at ECL? We would love that. That sounds great. Can the cluster reach out to repositories to help them get on board with adding sample PID metadata fields? Yeah, and maybe that we can think of, we've talked about having a version of the guidelines that's like guidance for repositories. So that could be a next step for us once we get the paper kind of drafted and maybe under review. Outreach to publishers, figuring out a publishing workflow for sample citation when our recommendations are ready for that. I think that's a great one too. And fortunately, we have Shelley and Christina that are working with AG. I'm sorry, I always forget your guys' actual positions at AGU. I tend to think of you as the AGU publishing people, so we'll be bothering you about that, I'm sure. And yeah, use cases that highlight the benefits. I think I totally agree that we need to find use cases where we're showing why it's so much easier. Or like why citation and data management from the start makes your life easier, even though it requires a little bit more time investment at the beginning. Open science leadership. I will try to remember, put that in my brain so I stop forgetting. Anybody else want to share any last thoughts on biggest roadblocks or next steps that we should take?
This is Sky. I mean, I guess one thing I'll mention, and I don't at all want this to be a downer, but you know, I posted the note about scalability. We actually don't know how some of these systems that we're counting on are going to operate as we start pushing billions of identifiers at them.
Yeah, that's a great point.
DataCite and IGSN theoretically is going to be able to scale. But if you look at all of the different things that go on there with how events are tracked, especially where we look at the interconnections that go on between identifiers, I'm not entirely sure that the system is going to, fully scale for that without, some adjustments. I think those adjustments can be made. I think it's a solvable problem, but I think it's something to kind of think about a little bit as we really start looking at some of these things that we should be able to do that are not unrealistic dreams. I think it's going to be important to test them and to flex them and to work at scaling those kinds of queries and things that we want to be able to do and reports that we want to be able to build. But pay close attention to what's happening with the broader infrastructure of this to see where it's going to go. We're about to push 1 million new IGSNs through just a piece of the geochemical collections that we have in USGS. And, even that is going to tax us, not in terms of the cyber infrastructure, but just our ability to sort of manage things at that scale. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And something that definitely needs to be highlighted. Thank you for sharing that. I also want to call out, there's some notes here about the work that collection managers have to do. This is kind of similar to scalability. It's a different kind of scalability, but the work collections managers have to do in order to relabel objects with PIDs. And yeah, important to remember that physical samples are physical, and there's always this massive collection that needs to be physically labeled and managed in a different sense. And I know that those repositories and museums just barely have enough staff to do what they're doing already. So it's a big ask to redo their cataloging system. So thinking about ways to make that less painful, but that might be a kind of one of those impossible tasks. You know, it just is always going to take a lot of manual labor. This is awesome. Thank you all so much for this. I think I'm going to hand it over to Joan to wrap up, but like if you want to help us write this into a paper, please let us know. We would really like to use these slides as a jumping off point for some of the discussion pieces of the papers, and we would love for you to join us on that. And you don't have to be like an author meeting with us every other week to be included as an author. You can show up for a couple hours and include some text, and we're happy to throw you on there as well. So.
Yeah, I don't have too much to wrap up, so we can also have time for questions too, but I'll just mention before that that we do have regular meetings as part of the physical samples curation cluster, and our next meeting is on Tuesday, February 13th at 9 a.m. Pacific or 12 Eastern. And in that meeting, we'll do kind of a debrief about this session and talk about some of our next steps and goals. And then we have 2 writing sprints scheduled for February because we do want to make progress on this and submit the paper as soon as we can. And we've been finding these writing sprints to be really useful and kind of fun to work together at the same time and talk about any issues that come up. So what we do in the writing sprints is get together, and there's usually been like 3 to 5 people join, and we will like write for 30 minutes and then maybe talk for a few and then write again for 30 minutes and do something like that. So it's been pretty fun. And we've made a lot of progress that way. Yeah, and then we have a link to join the cluster, and that's how we send out information about the things that we're working on and our upcoming meetings. And so if you're interested in that, please sign up to join the cluster. And I guess in addition to that, we are hoping to work with the RDA Complex Citation Working Group and schedule a hackathon for samples. We haven't quite done that yet because we definitely want to coordinate with the iSamples group and make sure that some key people are there. So we're hoping to schedule that for February or March. And so we'll send a message through the cluster listserv about that when we're able to schedule it. Yeah, and like we've mentioned, we do want to continue to gather feedback on the guidelines. We're planning to publish another version, but before we do publish that paper we're talking about. So there's some links there to directly contribute to that document, and then also contributing to the paper. So I did have to change the links recently because we realized we were using an old Google Drive folder, and we want these things to be in the ESIP official folder. And so you may have an old link if you're using a previous version of the link here, but I do have some clear indications in the documents to take you to the current version of the paper, which is provided here as well. So yeah, with that, we can take any questions, or if no one has any questions, we could leave a little early. Or any thoughts on what you think some of our next steps should be.
One thing that I think would be really nice actually is to find out, from my perspective, I know some repositories that have sample-based data, but have a more comprehensive list or directory of repositories that actually have sample-based data, and so that we can basically reach out and have discussions on how repositories for sample-based data can also align their practices and standards, and as we just said, integration of PIDs into the metadata and so on. We're talking right now more among the actual sample curators and sample registries. So it would be nice to broaden the participation, to have more repositories present here.
Yeah, that's a good point, and really targeting that on repositories that are likely to serve or likely to have like data sets that include samples.
Kirsten, I know you've done some stuff a little bit at one point or another with the Re3 data registry and that sort of thing. And I mean, at one point I thought we'd even talked about way back when maybe having something as part of the schema that would let us know when a repository was dealing with physical samples. Doesn't look like that ever necessarily culminated in anything, but that would be great if we had some ability through Re3 data and that registry itself to kind of get at that point of who's managing physical stuff.
We should approach them. Maybe that's, or have a category in the keywords that says samples or something. I mean, there's increasing attention, and I just heard about in Germany, chemistry, this national data infrastructure. They have a group for chemistry, and they now thinking much more carefully about the integration of the physical objects with the metadata. So it crosses a lot of different disciplines where we can learn from each other, but also, I mean, as we know through the Coptis meeting yesterday and so on, that publication practices or publication metadata really work best if there's a consistent practice across disciplines, because the publishers are not going to have 5 different procedures that align with different domains.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't set up our IGSN minting yet with the new data site system, Kirsten, and I was just wondering if you've done that, and sort of we've been talking with various other people about code sharing, and I don't know if your system is open source, but it would be nice just to talk to somebody that's implemented that, so we don't have to start from scratch necessarily.
Yeah, I think we should talk. I mean,
Okay.
we don't I mean, the code that we're still using for the registration, I mean, it's been revised obviously since the registration goes to DataCite and not to Berlin or Potsdam, where the old IGSN registration happened. But we can easily share. And we also, I mean, we have been talking with DataCite about becoming a consortium, service provider, basically. So we could provide Magic with the registration services without you having to set anything up.
Well, I mean, we already mint our data DOIs, so isn't it? I mean, if we can do that, basically,
Now, if you
system,
do
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
You
So
will
I
need
mean,
you will need a separate IGSN prefix
right,
repository, as they call it. Yeah.
but we should be able to just go
Yeah.
and get that since we have the other infrastructure in place. Okay, great. I can email you offline about that.
But it brings up an interesting an interesting question. If you as a data repository register samples, do you know if those samples were already registered somewhere else? How will, that's why I always say, it's a danger that if data repositories register samples, because there is no mechanism right now to find out if somebody else already registered a given physical object. It needs to be the person or institution who owns the physical object who registers it, and not the digital representation, because then we end up having 5 different IGSNs for the same sample, and those repositories don't know of each other having so that's a bit, I think the best practice really is it should be the person who has the physical object who registers.
Yeah, I mean,
I
I
agree. I mean,
don't
that's
disagree with you on that, Kirsten, but the reality is that the point where this work is going to get done is often at the point where somebody is touching the records again to do some sort of digital representation work in some way. And so that's where the work can go on. I mean, we're struggling with this just even within an institution like USGS, where we have labs that are now involved in cataloging, documenting digital representations, getting those into an appropriate repository, making them accessible. And we're trying to make sure that the guidance starts with document the physical sample and get it registered in the IGSN system first, because that then serves as the basis for everything else that we want to build on that. But I think the guidance needs to be very focused on trying to track down where that physical sample actually is. Not just that it existed at some point in the past and now we don't know, but where it is, who was responsible for it at the time? Do we know anything about how we can get to it now? So I think, regardless of who does the work, the guidance needs to be focused on the documentation of the physical artifacts and their provenance, regardless of that's who actually owns that thing now, because there are going to be many cases where the owners, the managers, the placement of those physical objects, it is just not even accessible anymore. And somebody's got to do the work of setting the record straight.
Yeah, looking over the sort of required fields for the IGSN, it would be sort of cool to be able to say where it is now, not just where it was collected.
Right.
Yeah, right now the tricky bit that I've seen is if someone who's working on a sample is working on a publication that requires IGSNs, to them that's just a roadblock to get the paper out the door. So they'll just make an IGSN real quick, and may or may not consult repositories first.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot
of
of practice, and I wrote you earlier today about a PI coming to us who wanted to register samples that were taken from course at Oregon State. And so this, the subsample versus the parent sample sitting, there's a lot of practice that needs to be, defined. But
and thank goodness you
know
caught it.
we're at the time out. It might be a good discussion for the cluster to have at some point. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, these are all really great points. Thank you. We're a little over time, so we will end now and hopefully continue some of these discussions in our cluster meeting. Thank you all. We really enjoyed all of your contributions and really appreciate you joining today.